Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Boundless Immigration and the Budget Ask Me Anything. My name is Maggie Riley. I am the Immigration Law and Policy Analyst for Boundless Immigration. I'm here to answer your questions today about the immigration reform contained in the Budget Reconciliation Bill. We're going to take just a few minutes to allow everybody to join and get situated, and we'll take off just in a few minutes. All right, everybody. Gave it a few minutes to wait for a few more people to join us. Didn't want to get started too soon. As I may have mentioned before, for some of you who are already here, my name is Maggie Riley, and I'm the Immigration Law and Policy Analyst for Boundless Immigration. And I wanted to take some time today to talk with everybody about two topics that you really might not usually consider going together, and that is immigration reform and the U.S. federal budget. So immigration has been in the news a lot, especially over the last few years, but the past few weeks have been especially interesting as we've really seen the opportunity for meaningful immigration reform for the first time in nearly 40 years. The last meaningful immigration reform happened in 1986, and we really haven't seen any major shifts since then. However, with lawsuits tied up in the courts, they can often take months to years, as well as legislation stalled in a very acrimonious and divided Congress. It has fallen to the budget reconciliation process to give us our best chance at a meaningful change in the immigration laws. So that's what I'd like to spend some time answering your questions about today and giving a little bit of extra information and context about how that process works and what we might expect to see going forward. So one of the first main questions we got, which I think really covers a lot of this, is sort of what is budget reconciliation and what should we be concerned about regarding this budget process? So budget reconciliation is what it sounds like to a certain degree. It does touch on the budget. It's a special process that can be used sometimes to pass the budget along with other policy changes that maybe don't at first glance seem like they're relevant. However, there is a set of rules that determine what kinds of items can be added to the budget bill. And then from that point, it can actually be passed with only a simple majority rather than the usual supermajority required. And as well, it is filibuster proof. So the House of Representatives did pass a budget bill back in late August. They sent it forward to the Senate. And at that time, the Democrats had to make arguments to keep the immigration provisions in the bill. They had to convince a woman, the Senate Parliamentarian, who is sort of the rules keeper for the Senate, that the bills and provisions related to immigration also had a sufficient relationship to government spending, so the money the government is putting out into the country, as well as revenue, which is the money that the government is collecting. Unfortunately, on Sunday, the Parliamentarian did rule that the majority of the immigration provisions that had been included by the Senate Democrats in the budget reconciliation bill were not sufficiently related to the budget to be included. This means, unfortunately, that a lot of these provisions won't be allowed to go forward as part of the budget reconciliation process. So this sends Democrats back to the drawing board to a certain degree to kind of decide how they're going to proceed next. I do want to caution at this point that not all immigration provisions were stripped out of the budget reconciliation bill. So though the overall news reporting that you may have seen was that immigration was really completely removed, though this was a setback for Democrats and for immigration advocates, it's not the end of the game. There are still provisions that they're looking at to help reduce backlog for the employment-based visa green cards applicants, as well as potentially recapturing unused green cards that may be set to expire later this month. So it's not all bad news, but I am going to talk a little bit more about sort of what the Parliamentarian decided and where we can go from here, because I think that is really going to tell us a bit more about what maybe we can expect. But I do want to stress that no, not all is lost. The game is not over. We're just, we're stretching at the halftime mark. So as far as what can happen next, the Senate Parliamentarian, as I said, ruled that a large portion of the immigration provisions weren't sufficiently related to the budget. They didn't have a big enough impact on government spending or government revenue to really warrant being included in the budget bill. What this means now is that Senate Democrats can go back and try to fine-tune their arguments. So they can remove things that they think maybe are too far afield that the parliamentarian might have thought weren't really related to financial concerns. They can refine arguments that are already there to maybe make them have a less broad impact. So one of the things that the parliamentarian actually said was, it is clear that, legalizing millions of people would have a large impact on the budget. Obviously, these are all people who would get work authorization. These are people who would be going to their jobs, paying taxes, spending money in the economy. However, because it was such a broad policy change, she felt that the policy change was bigger than the budgetary impact. So what Senate Democrats might try to do is take a step back and say, is there a way that we can make a smaller change that still serves the purposes that we're looking for, can help a significant group of people, but without having such a large budgetary impact that the parliamentarian sends us back to the starting line? So that's what Democrats are working on right now. They're in a bit of a mad scramble, and it was just announced last night that the Rules Committee will actually be convening on Saturday to discuss sort of the next steps forward, and then collecting all of the other House of Representatives committees' notes and amendments so that they can send that forward next month to the Budget Committee. At that time is when we would really expect to see more substantial changes rather than now, where we're seeing really a lot of that procedural rule checking as they get ready to sort of jump back into the game. Currently, I would say that one of the leading, and in fact, actually, let me circle back to what we think we might expect to see and let you guys know what our other two options we think might be were. So you may have heard floating around ideas that we can actually overrule the parliamentarian, or that the Senate majority party can, which at this time are the Democrats. The Senate Majority Leader, Mr. Charles Schumer, does appoint the Senate parliamentarian. The parliamentarian is an unelected, nonpartisan position. They usually serve over the course of multiple presidencies, as the current parliamentarian has. The current parliamentarian has been in office for I think since the George Bush administration, so they've been around for a while. But that is an option that the majority leader can choose to overrule the parliamentarian with a 50-50 vote of the Senate. However, as some of you may be aware, the Democrats don't necessarily have all 50 votes together in the Senate. There is some gamesmanship occurring between the moderate wing of the party and the progressive wing of the party about when votes should occur, what the price tag should be, and what the overall policies involved should actually be. So it is not really likely to many people's minds, myself included, that the Democrats in the Senate would be able to overrule the parliamentarian, just because they don't have the votes. If they had all 50 votes together, they could also count on potentially Vice President Harris to cast the tie-breaking vote. Following on to that, the other option, is the third option, is actually to fire the parliamentarian. And this is something that can also be done by the majority party, but as you may have gathered, based on how unlikely it is that they will overrule the parliamentarian, it seems less likely that they would let her go because they disagree with her. That is an option, but to my mind, it is not a particularly likely one, and the Biden administration and several members, lawmakers and aides on the Hill, have indicated that they're not really willing to play hardball in that way, whether that's, fidelity to the rules or whatever the case may be. I don't think it's likely that we're going to see an overruling or a dismissal of the parliamentarian. So at this time, that looks like then the most likely option currently is to try to submit some of these smaller, more refined arguments and see what we can get through the parliamentarian. So I know that was a lot to digest. If y'all are coming up with any more questions, anything is occurring to you, just drop it in the chat and we will get to those as best we can. I did want to touch on, now that I told you guys a little bit about what the current options are, what might happen next, what might be the most likely outcome. So as I had touched on, Senate Democrats don't have all 50 votes. There are several members of the Senate who are currently sort of holding out on for various reasons. Some of it is policy directly related to immigration. Some of it is related to the overall price tag, which is still currently sitting around $3.5 trillion. Some of them are waiting on the infrastructure bill to be voted on first. And so there's a lot of sort of moving parts going on. The goal really is to get these smaller changes through. Right now, one of the leading options being discussed is a process known as immigration registry. Now, registry is something that's actually been around for about 100 years, and it is a mechanism that allows certain folks who are already in the United States without authorization to adjust their status if they've been continuously present in the United States for a certain length of time, have good moral character, and then meet other certain requirements. So, generally this is going to be folks who don't have criminal history, that are able to show that they've been living in the United States since January 1st, 1972. That's the current registry date. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's a very large number of people in the United States who entered after 1972 who would otherwise be eligible for registry adjustment, but because they were either entered later or, frankly, were born after this occurred, especially, for example, many folks who qualify for DACA, the registry is not of a lot of use to them. So there is a lot of discussion around moving up the registry date. It has not been revealed exactly what that slated registry date could be. However, this seems to be one of the leading arguments that the Democrats are trying to put forward in reconciliation. One of the reasons there is because it would create a sizable positive impact. A significant number of people would benefit from a registry date move forward. But in addition to that, this actually is an update to an already existing law. This isn't a change to, a new law that's being introduced through reconciliation. This is actually an update to something that's already been on the books for about 100 years. So as far as the parliamentarians' concerns about this is a really big policy change versus its budgetary impact, the argument here is this is an adjustment to an already existing policy, and it has a budgetary impact. So certain members of the Senate, like Bob Menendez, who's really been leading the charge on a lot of this legislation, has actually said that he would prefer to see this option going forward. And if that turns out to be, hopefully his optimism is warranted, because right now that is our leading argument that we're seeing coming out of the reconciliation talks. Now, as far as who this could benefit, you may have heard I had touched on DACA folks. Originally, the budget reconciliation that went to the Senate and then to the Parliamentarian was estimated to benefit approximately 8 million individuals who don't already have documented or authorized status. 8 million folks sounds like a very large number. In the broader context of our economy, it is not insignificant. However, as I had noted, the Parliamentarian did say that she felt that the impact of legalizing 8 million people was going to be larger as a policy change than a budget change. Because of that, it's likely to presume that the Senate is going to whittle down that $8 million person number to impact a smaller group of individuals. So while this is not the news that many of us were hoping to hear, we really wanted to see that full reform impact as many people as possible. It does still seem that a sizable group of people should be included. At this time, the most reasonable assumption as to who might make the cut would be DACA holders or folks who would be eligible for DACA. DACA is still tied up. It has been held up by courts in Texas and legislation. There are 3 separate acts that touch on DACA, 2 in the Senate and 1 in the House, have both been stalled since February and March, respectively. And so budget reconciliation actually is the process that is most likely to give us a solution for all the folks that have been trapped in limbo while DACA gets ping-ponged around through the courts. Because there is such a sizable and overwhelming support for DACA holders and for the DACA program generally, it seems reasonable that that would be a group of people who are likely to benefit from any legalization process included in the budget reconciliation. Another group that we are anticipating may see some relief are farm workers, who are another group that has been receiving sort of additional attention over the previous months, receiving additional visas from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and so there is reason to believe that that group may also be involved in reform and budget reconciliation. It's too soon to say for sure whether temporary protected status or deferred enforced departure, or DED, if those will be included, as the national security and vetting questions are often held up by the Republican Party as a reason to exclude those individuals from broader reforms. So at this time, we're really hoping for DACA and potentially farm workers, but we're not expecting to see that 8 million number that we'd originally hoped for. So just to wrap up, I know that's so much to say, to process, but so to wrap up, what we're really hoping to see is these new arguments coming through probably next week. This is, it's an estimated time frame based on other reporting that we've seen coming off the Hill. So there is hope that the infrastructure bill is scheduled currently to be voted for on September 27th. And the plan of Senate Democrats is to bring budget reconciliation back up for a vote in conjunction with that infrastructure bill. So following the markup in committee on Saturday, we're really hoping to see more about what exactly is going to be contained in this new budget package when it comes out next week, and find out exactly how many people could benefit. Presuming that this budget packet is approved, it will make it through the Parliamentarian, then in that case it would have to be approved by both the House and the Senate before being signed by the President. The current package as it stands would have allowed for folks to receive their green cards in 6 months or May 2022, whichever comes first. So we have a little bit of a rough timeline, but again, that's going to be subject to whatever changes are made in the markup process over the coming days. All right, so I accidentally answered the next question there, sort of at the tail end of that last one, which was, when will this come true? When are we going to see this dream of immigration reform finally come true? And unfortunately, that is a really difficult question to answer. As I had touched on at the beginning of our talk, it's been nearly 40 years since we've seen a meaningful immigration reform, and many folks in, statuses like DACA, statuses like TPS have been caught in this sort of renew process for quite some time now. However, given the amount of pressure that is on the Democratic Party to make something happen, something meaningful happen on immigration right now, this does seem to me to be one of the best chances we've really had in many, many years to make honest, helpful, impactful reform. Congress will reconvene session on October 11th. So depending what happens next week, I feel that really before the end of the year, we should know a lot more. Of course, this is all given various government shutdown issues, but presuming that the government doesn't shut down due to the budget cliff, then we should hopefully have more information in the coming weeks. But anything that is passed, we're going to be looking at least 6 months before we start to see honest implementation. Unfortunately, the wheels of bureaucracy and legislation can move rather slowly. As I had mentioned, the goal is to see these come up for a vote next on the 27th. And so really we're hoping to see before the end of the month a more firm idea of exactly which direction this conversation is going to go. So finally, we did get some questions as well. Somebody had touched on a little bit separate from budget reconciliation, but what is the government planning on doing to assist legal immigrants who are currently or who are on F1 visas or F1 status? So for those of you who aren't aware, the F1 is a student visa and is often used for folks to attend university here in the United States, though it can be used for other educational prospects as well. And there have been a lot of difficulties for folks on F visas as well as J and M visas over the prior several years related to CVIS, changes in reporting, and of course the travel bans that were instituted under the previous administration, as well as the COVID-19 travel bans that we've been experiencing for the past year and a half or so. The major update that came about regarding F1, two major pieces of news there. The first was that in March of 2021, so earlier this year, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, did work with the Department of Homeland Security to waive interviews, in-person interviews for folks seeking F1 visas. Now, originally, this interview waiver was just for people who were applying for the same visa category. So if you already were in an F, you needed an additional F, you could waive this in-person interview. Unfortunately, that did help some people. It didn't help a very large number of people. On September 14th, they expanded that policy to allow folks to waive the in-person interview subject to the consular officer's discretion. If they are applying for even a new visa, presuming that they haven't been denied in the past, that there's no national security issues, or for somebody who also lives in a country that is already a participant in the visa waiver program, which is also called ESTA sometimes. So for individuals who had been tied up waiting for interviews when the consulates have been closed during the pandemic, this is very welcome news, especially given the very long backlogs that grew up over the past year for interviews overseas, given that the consulates have been closed. The additional piece of good news is the gradual rollbacks that we're seeing of the travel bans, specifically the travel bans related to COVID-19. Last week, the government announced that we will be removing the travel ban that prevented individuals from the UK or the EU from entering the United States. So folks will need to show that they have been vaccinated before entering, but we will begin allowing folks from 33 countries to enter the United States on visas. So for folks who have been caught up either in visa interview backlogs or who have been unable to enter the country because of a country travel ban, those are going to be loosening up, and we should start seeing folks able to enter the country and resume their studies again very soon. I did want to give a quick warning here. I'll wrap up. I have one or two more questions to do, but just to let y'all know, we've got about 6 more minutes. So if you do have any burning questions, please drop them in the chat for us. One other question I had was, what is USCIS doing about the rising costs of visas and the backlogs? As far as the costs of visas, that's a little bit of an open question. There was, as some of you may recall, a very large push by USCIS under the previous administration to drastically increase the fees for many immigration benefits, especially for naturalization and premium processing, among other things. Though that rule ended up being enjoined, which it was prevented from going into effect, there is still an additional rule, and the government does still seem to be considering how they are going to deal with filing fees for various types of cases. There are questions as to the financial stability of USCIS, which it turns out to be largely not as serious as had been reported last year. But the fact of the backlog is a real thing. And so as far as rising visa costs, I would expect that we will see movement on that over the coming year, unfortunately. However, we are seeing the government reinstitute certain kinds of fee waivers, which is something that the previous administration had been taking off the table for a lot of people. Another thing that, the backlog itself. So many of you are probably very well aware that there was a very long wait to receive an interview, to receive a green card, any kind of action at all, honestly, from CIS on immigration processes. And unfortunately, that backlog really grew over the last couple of years. The Government Accountability Office actually reported that there was an 85% increase in the wait times for immigration adjudication or processing between 2015 and 2020. So this is a huge increase in wait times. Some things that we have been seeing in the past couple months that have been heartening. USCIS has been actively seeking feedback from immigration applicants, so folks who are seeking visas and green cards, but also from immigrant advocates and immigration attorneys about things they can do to remove barriers to the immigration process or to make the system more usable. And so just for starters, the fact that they are considering how can we make this system easier is a great sign after the last couple of years. But another fact there is that they have really been taking suggestion and having listening sessions through their ombudsman to determine what would be meaningful and impactful. They have scrapped the hiring freeze, so they now are hiring officers at the lockboxes to intake applications and to submit or send out receipt notices. They are hiring interviewing officers so that interviews can happen more quickly. They've also opened up hiring for things like asylum officers, because one thing that happened is during some of these situations that have occurred at the border over the last several years is they have repurposed folks from the employment visa section or folks from the family visa section towards different kinds of cases. So now that hiring is back on the table, we're hoping to see some of those processing times begin to come down over the long term as folks get trained and they start working through those previous cases in the backlog. All right, I did not have any more questions. So these are all the ones that I had been sent in so far. So I just want to close by saying, despite everything we've talked about, I know many of us have been waiting a long time for immigration reform. Many of us have friends, family members, coworkers who are impacted every day by the things that are going on behind closed doors in Washington, D.C., or even, in our own communities regarding immigration. And so despite the Parliamentarian's ruling last week, despite the backlogs at USCIS, there are reasons to hope. We are seeing positive change. There's movement afoot, and I'm really hoping that over the next coming days, we're going to see what our folks in DC are really going to do for us on immigration. If you have any more questions, if there's something that occurred to you while I was talking today, please reach out to us through our social media accounts. You can get in touch with us here on Instagram, or you can get in touch with us via Twitter. Send us your questions, and we can do our best to respond to y'all. Information is power, and we just want to make sure you know what's going on out there. So thank you again. Keep fighting the good fight, and hang in there, everybody. Have a great day.